Welcome, good afternoon, everyone. It's not quite the graveyard shift. I think that was David's session, the first one after lunch. Always the most difficult to handle. But a fascinating showcase of some master planning work that's happening up in Guinea. For those of you that were here, or those of you that missed it. Some of you had the misfortune of going to listen to more retail statistics, but at least you're here now. And you can listen to us. Let me very quickly introduce myself and my panel. My name is Guy Briggs. I am an architect, urban designer, and I'm a director at DHK Architects, based in Cape Town, but originally from this town, from Joburg. And I have a panel of three to assist me here today and to take your questions. Starting on the far left is Cameron Rush, who is the Managing Director, as it says, of Planning Systems based in Kenya, and he is an urban planner by background. Bridget Samula, who is a Managing Director at AECOM, based in Uganda, but lived here in Joburg for many years, for 15 years, before moving back to Uganda quite recently. And Bridget is a transportation engineer by background. And then we have Igor Matthias, who comes from all over the world. He is now based in Zambia. He comes from a private equity background, and he is now involved with the development of the Kalumbila new town, which he's been telling me is the first new town to be built in Zambia since independence. Is that right? So we've got a diverse panel, diverse set of skills, interests, specializations, and we're looking forward to a robust discussion. Do I just click this to get onto presentation? Here we go. Designing for density is the topic. I've put together a few slides to introduce us to this afternoon's subject. Having sat through the many sessions that we've had over the last couple of days, I've realized that most of my slides are quite redundant, in fact, because the topics have all been covered in a lot more depth than I can possibly do. And being an architect, the first thing I'm going to do, of course, is talk about economics, which I'm probably least qualified of all the people in this room to do. But of course, the narrative of certainly many of the previous API summits, and continuing in this summit, is this narrative of Africa rising. And yes, there's been phenomenal growth of African economies over the last several years. And as we well know, that growth, the economic growth, has been tailing off, and this poses substantial conundrums for the investors among us and the developers amongst us. But what, of course, is critical from the point of view of us as planners and architects and designers and also policymakers and managers of cities is that the urbanization and the densification that has paralleled that economic growth is not tailing off. We heard statistics earlier today. I'm doing what everybody else did, which is flip over slides too quickly. So, of course, that urbanization is paralleling a societal transformation in Africa. We're moving from a continent that is a predominantly agrarian economy to one that is fast becoming a predominantly urban economy. And we see that in the following slides, which highlight the number of cities across Africa with 1 million plus citizens. And the red dots there highlight in 1990 the number of cities with 1 million plus inhabitants. Currently, today, number of cities with 1 million plus inhabitants. And by 2030, the number of cities that are forecast to have 1 million plus inhabitants. So the urbanization is continuing, and it's continuing at a rapid pace. We heard statistics earlier today of kind of around 5% growth of the number of people in many of these cities across the continent. And what does that mean? For the majority of people, that means arriving and living in slums. I think it was Keisha Russ this morning who talked about, for those of you who were here this morning, I think many of you were still in bed because of last night's fantastic dinner. But she was talking about 60% of the urban population in Africa living in slums. It's a phenomenal number. The global average is more like 34%. So it shows we've got a massive catch-up to do. Just by a kind of quick tangent here, this is a slide that represents the growth of Cape Town over the last 100 years. And the interesting numbers here are the way in which Cape Town from 1904, when it was a fairly small city, occupying just 23 square kilometers, small population, but had a density of 115 persons per hectare. Fast forward to 2000, nearly 100 years later, the city sprawled massively, population has ballooned, and there's a density of only 39 people per hectare. However, in the last nearly 20 years, there have been two very interesting things that have happened. The population has more than doubled. It's nearly trebled. It's now closer to 4 million. And the city limits have not vastly expanded. What has happened is that we've seen massive spikes in density, and that density has happened largely in the informal areas of the city. Khayelitsha, which is Cape Town's largest, what we call township, colloquial term for an area of town that under apartheid was historically built for black people, but also these days encompasses informal settlements, has residential densities measured in terms of people per hectare that are close to the residential densities on Manhattan Island. And that, of course, is with a GLA that is somewhere between a tenth and a hundredth of the GLA that there is on Manhattan. So we're seeing massive overcrowding in these environments, and I picked Cape Town, but this is a common factor across many of our cities. And with that kind of rapid urbanization, and with the increase in densities and with the overcrowding, we are seeing a huge number of issues. And I'm highlighting just 4 primary ones here. There is a massive backlog in infrastructure. We've been talking about this earlier. And in many cases, a failure of existing infrastructures. Congestion, common cause that many of our African cities are extremely congested when it comes to transportation. Nairobi's been mentioned many times. Lagos is very well known. Even Cape Town. Cape Town is now officially the most congested city in South Africa. It doesn't compare to places like Nairobi and Lagos, but nevertheless, it's becoming more and more of an issue. And going with that is a lack of access for the poor. You have the poor spending phenomenal amounts of their income. 50% of their income is being spent on transport, which is completely unsustainable. And so you're seeing an entrenchment of poverty amongst the newly urbanized, and you're seeing a social breakdown. A rise in crime, rise of gangs, decreasing health, decreasing opportunities to participate in the economy, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just the issues to date. We've got 2 major issues going forward that are likely only to exacerbate these previous issues. There's the question of climate change, and of course in David's presentation previously, it was a question I was going to ask you, David, in fact, and you dealt with it before I could get there, was to what's going to happen when sea level rises and the city's going to be underwater. Of course, the master plan is addressing that, and it's starting to put into place ways of dealing with that. But I think that's just one aspect of climate change, and it's going to be a huge issue for many cities across the continent. And then what I've called here the opportunity divide. The rich or the well-off increasingly have opportunities to access the economy, to access health, et cetera, et cetera. We were talking earlier about what's going to happen to jobs. Well, for the wealthy, that's not really an issue because you get retrained or you find another way of earning an income. But for the poor, who, as Francois really mentioned, have only their labor to sell, the opportunity for selling your labor becomes increasingly less and less and less. And digital technology and the rise in digital technology, of course, only increases that opportunity divide. So, it brings us back to the question of how do we design for density. And that's the last of my slides. Now, I think the panel just before lunch set a great precedent. I prepared a number of questions to ask our panelists. But before I do that, I think we're going to make this an open mic session. And so I'm going to look around the floor, and I'd love to take questions from the floor first. If you don't have any, I've got the ones I prepared earlier. But let's try and have this as a discussion. Any hands? And I know you wanted to ask a question of Professor Verrilli earlier, but you didn't get a chance. So start now. What I think we'll do is let's take, if there are 4 or 5 questions around the floor, let's take them and then we'll start a discussion.
So my question is more a fundamental question around what's the root cause of the density issues. So I know you highlighted some of the issues that come out of having a density problem, but what's the actual root cause, and what's then the role of trying to design a city to address those root causes? And what do you think are some of the solutions that we should be thinking about and innovating around?
So in a nutshell, that question is, what is causing the density, or the over-densification? It's a pretty big fundamental question. And what are some of the solutions around that? Any other? Okay. There's a hand up at the back there, and then there's a hand here. Can we get a roaming mic? Might as well go ahead, and then we'll...
I think mine is more of a comment, and I think it is an extension of what the guy was asking earlier. I think the main reason, which may be apparent to a lot of people, is that there's so much development. If you take Cape Town as an example, there's so much development that's taking place around the city. And you're finding people, for instance, from the Eastern Cape who are then picking away and moving from there because there's none. Well, if there is, there's corruption, there's political instability and all these other issues that are affecting these other regions, and that's why people are actually running away, because they're looking for, to be in places where the development is. So, again, I think it's a question around your spatial planning and making sure that you, are accounting for this. But I think it's more of a social issue, because as long as you're not creating the employment opportunities, then you're always going to be faced with that situation. If we take your slides, I think it was 774 million, or I can't remember that number, but the point is that number is going to develop, it's going to double again in a very short space of time, because we're faced with the exact same problem that we faced with more than 20 years ago. So, yeah.
Two things. One, with the land issue in Cape Town, because obviously not all the land around the city can be used for developing homes and sustainable places for people to live. So I'm not sure if you know, but sounds like you've done a bit of architecture in Cape Town. So do you know what the city's planning around that, or are they just going to carry on with their current trajectory of just commercializing the whole city and acting like people don't need a place to stay because people work there? And I know you just mentioned how transport costs will take up 40%. So number one, what is the city doing to address such a thing? I don't expect you to know, but maybe if you have any idea. And then secondly, whose job is it to drive innovation? Is it the local council? Is it the government? Or is it developers? Because we know, I'm sure all of us here know of a lot of innovations in designing low-cost housings, modular homes. We can use all sorts of materials. Cape Town is at a port. There's old, what do you call those things? Old crates. Yeah, containers, sorry. You have old containers, but I've seen in Kailicha maybe there's 2 or 3, but no one's really buying into that. Why is that? Like, I've never really understood that. Maybe you can shed some light there. Thanks.
Okay, so that's two questions there. One is, what is the City of Cape Town doing to address the housing crisis, in a nutshell? And the other is, whose responsibility is it to drive innovation? And I think yours was more a comment on what is driving densification, and we might add to that. Should we take one last question, because otherwise I'm going to forget the first one.
Okay, so my question's really got to do with playing devil's advocate in a way. So I think many of you might be familiar with Francois Verley's essential 40-40 ratio split, which drives densification. So you mentioned that poor people largely sell their labor, that's their currency. So when you're designing for density, are you intending to design for density in the communities in which they live? Or are you intending to design for density to address the 40-40 issue where they're spending more than 40% of their income on transport? So by that, if we take the example of Cape Town, are you intending to densify the city further, bringing the labor closer to the commercial area, or are you intending to densify in Khayelitsha and other places?
So I'm now starting to regret that I put up any Cape Town slides at all, because I'm the only person here on the panel from Cape Town. But I think it's a good question, and we can make that more of a general question. And the nub of that question is, how do we locate interventions? And at the nub of your question was does one look at designing and change in situ within the existing communities, or does one look to relocate and create new places for people? Should we stop there? I think I'm going to start with the innovation question, and I think I'm going to throw that one at Igor, just because he is sitting on the end and furthest away from me. But I think you might have some interesting answers for us.
So we have an interesting experience. Because we're building a new town, we have no government support. So everything we've done is on a private basis. So to answer your first point of who's responsible, in our case, it's very evident. We own the giant hole in the ground next door because we're building a town right next to Zambia's and potentially Africa's largest copper mine. So it's our responsibility. But at the same time, we are trying to make a place that's inclusive. So in terms of the question of innovation, in terms of understanding what the needs of the community are, and we can't limit ourselves to just the people who work at the mine and the support services. We have to think broader than that, because I'll give you an example. There's a little village called Kisasa. When I came to Zambia in 2013, it had under 5,000 people. Today it has 20,000. This place has no planning, no services, nothing. So I think it's important, both from a commercial point of view, as well as I hate to use the word morality, but I think it's important that as developers, we look to find solutions for both those communities, because at I guess in the not too distant future, that community and this community are one and the same. Now, I'm not sure I've actually answered your question, but I guess what I'm trying to give the audience a flavor for is that we have a very different setup. And because we have a very different setup, all our solutions are homegrown. We can't rely too much on third parties, including government, to help us. What we have to do is think of what suits our environment the best. The town is planned around 5,000 hectares. And to your point about density, it's very easy to locate houses 100 meters from each other. Great. But that's neither clever, it's not efficient, it's not effective. And it actually doesn't do anything to solve the other problems, because we still have people in the town who don't earn a lot of money, but have to get to work. Whether it's at the filling station, whether it's at the supermarket, we still have to accommodate them in real time. So what we try and do is look at how best we can densify so as to create a certain center of gravity, which then attracts other retailers, other service providers. People can go who can drive through and say, oh, I get it, I see what you've done here, and I think this would be an interesting place to locate a business or do something else.
Bridget, Cameron, either of you like to add to the to what Igor was saying in terms of innovation?
I think the role, practically, private sector does have more space and more chances to take with innovation. However, the environment needs to be created and the framework needs to be created by government. So what we've found through a lot of the master planning processes that have happened that I've been involved in, especially within the South African space, is around government creating an enabling environment for private sector to be innovative. And because government cannot afford to take chances on things that might or mightn't work, private sector does that. So you almost have to be able to create for them that environment, whether it's through provision of infrastructure and utilities, but also the policies that allow the innovation to happen so that you can allow cities to grow in that space.
I'd agree with that. I think what we're seeing up in Kenya, in Nairobi, is there is no plan from the counties. There's been some developed, but they're just not enforced and not looked at, and so that framework needs to be there to ensure that sustainable development happens. Otherwise, we're in a situation where it's all developer-led, and unless they're coming to the table with morality or social responsibility at the back of their mind, then it's just wild growth, and there's no kind of plan that people are going to be able to use going forward. And we heard earlier today that these consequences in terms of planning, in terms of development, live with us for the next 150 years or so. For my clients, innovation is a big thing. There's been other conferences where I've been involved in terms of green technology and these type of things where it costs maybe an extra 1% of capital cost, but the savings going forward are sort of upwards to 40%. So, sustainability of water, sustainability of energy, all these types of things are certainly incorporated, but it's unfortunately in a lot of places up to the developer whether that happens or not.
Cameron, I want to stick with you for a moment. I want to come back to the question on Khayelitsha, but to reframe it, because I think it's as applicable to Nairobi. So are the appropriate places to intervene? Is it Kibera? Is it downtown Nairobi? Or is it elsewhere?
Yeah, it's a good question. And again, I think what needs to happen is a proper plan and framework put in place so that these interventions can be rolled out properly and so that they actually have a purpose and you can see the results. Kibera, biggest slum in Nairobi in Kenya. It's really interesting. It's got an economy all of its own. The value of a shilling there is 4 to 5 times what it's worth outside of Kibera slum, which is really interesting. There have been interventions there where the World Bank and the UN came in and developed better housing for the residents, but they effectively went in there, left, went back to their shacks, and were renting out the better quality apartments themselves. So they were happy to get it and be able to use it and make a margin on it, but they were also equally happy to be living in that community of Kibera. So yeah, the whole social side of it is, I don't think I'm the proper person to say this is what should or shouldn't happen, but it needs to be developed with the community and with the government, working hand in hand, and developers need to understand that they have an important role to play in terms of making sure that that happens.
And in fact, we've seen similar aspects happening in Cape Town and other parts of South Africa where government develops housing for the poor, hands it over. As we were hearing earlier today, the rand value of any given house developed by government is around 160,000 rand. And usually when that's handed over, title doesn't immediately follow, but the house very rapidly changes hands on the informal market for around 30 to 40,000 rand, which is to say you've got somewhere near a 70 to 80% discount on its intrinsic value, and it now no longer has any tradable value. It cannot be mortgaged, it can't be developed, etc., etc. So there is a massive issue, I think, with titling and property as an asset in that sense. I'm not going to come to the question on Cape Town and what the city's doing, because I think it's possibly too specific. But happy to talk to you afterwards about that. I do have some insights there. I wanted to come back to some broader questions. One of the ones that I had written down in advance, and it's one that is specifically to do with transport and infrastructure and this question of congestion, and it's one for you, Bridget. This issue of ever-increasing congestion, it's one of the most apparent failures in African cities. And it's a very broad question, but how do you see the most appropriate and feasible approach to managing and reversing the congestion issues?
Thank you. In a strange way, I'm going to respond to his question about densification, because I think one of the hard lessons we've had to learn in strategic planning for transport for cities is that if we do not understand why the numbers are the way they are and how they're growing in that way, we will never be able to design corridors and the right transport modes for the right corridors, and we can't be able to influence, at the very least, corridor development. So some of the causes, and so for the last 10 or so years, when we are doing transport master plans, the first 2 chapters are usually around land use and economic development, because then we can understand what's causing the numbers to grow. So some of the causes for densification, and I'm going to talk broadly around British colonial cities, which are many of the cities that are struggling with congestion right now, but I'll also talk in the South African context. So some of them, cut across both of them. So the first one is rural-urban migration, mostly because of the economic potential of people who live in different districts. So politically, many of the rulers and the presidents have tried to centralize control into 1 or 2 or 3 major cities. You will have a country like Uganda where if you're not in Kampala, everything happens in Kampala. So if you're not in the city center, then what is the type of economy that you expected to have? And the districts, we have 54 districts, but we technically have 1 economic node. So rural-urban migration becomes quite an important issue because people move to be able to find work, to be able to make their lives better, to be able to go to school and have access to services. Population growth is also a big one in East Africa. You've seen there are numbers in East Africa that talk about Uganda as well. We have the highest number of children per household, that's 6. 80% of our population is below the age of 26. So population growth has become a huge issue. And because of that, you find that households are bigger, and because they're bigger, there's more pressure on facilities and services. So knowing that and understanding that, and the third one being car ownership and car use. So within African cities, within South Africa, it is a densification issue. I live too far away from my workplace, so the moment I can afford a car, because I can then be able to afford, I can be able to buy a car. So car ownership and car use are synonymous with affluence in many African countries. So it is not uncommon in countries like Uganda, Nigeria, Kenya, Zambia, to find a home with about 6 or 7 cars. That with cities that were planned in the 60s, with sewage systems that were planned in the 60s, there's a lot of pressure on the government. There's a lot of pressure on the land, slum areas not properly designed, so floodlines and stormwater, they're all under pressure. So what ends up happening is you have cities that come to a standstill when there's rain for example, and that's a common, because the roads are basically flooded. So what we found when trying to do the transport and the congestion is the congestion planning or transport planning for cities for the future is to try and reset the button. And we can do it in many ways. There's the easy one of trying to develop new cities. But we all know from the case of Brasilia, it's not a situation of build a city and they will come. Because people go where there's an economic node, and mining happens to be one of the ones that can be able to attract people, but it's also a huge driver because people will really move and get into their cars for the school trip and for the work trip. Those are the two major issues that we find congestion on the road. So there's been a big drive and a big investment in trying to get mass transit. And that mass transit could be bus rapid transit, it could be railway lines, to be able to focus, but we are playing catch up. The money doesn't really exist. And we find ourselves with transportation designs, the famous roundabouts in Nairobi and Uganda, where you have a traffic policeman trying to manage people around a roundabout. And it would take you a good 45 minutes to maneuver your way around that. But it's old designs as well. So the older cities are not responding to what the new requirements of the cities are. But I do think we as engineers and planners also play a role in not trying to drive the city in a consistent way. We are not very quick to say, what was your old plan? Let me build on that to the new plan. Because all of us want to start our own little bit and piece so that we are not working to what was existing, but we want to continue on. So I think the major dilemma we shall continue to have for transportation and trying to alleviate congestion is traffic management. I think that's a short-term plan, but otherwise it has to be housing and densification around the new cities, and as the cities grow, we try to look for houses where people can live, but most importantly, where people can work. And those two, I think, are the ways in which we can be able to build our cities differently, because for as long as the political environment lends itself to having a very centralized form of economy, it's going to be quite difficult to be able to diversify to the other districts that we have. Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget. I'm conscious we're running out of time. These things always go far quicker than they should. Are there any burning questions from the floor? We can probably take one more. None? Did I see any hands up? No? I think we're done. I'm actually, before we close, I'm going to ask you, Cameron, to do a quick response to what Bridget was saying. And to pick up on this question of appropriate urban form and appropriate model.
Yeah, transport's a big issue. I think on the topic of urbanization, there was a comment there that, and it applies sub-Saharan wide, there's currently 1 billion people there. That's going to go to 2 billion by 2050, so in the next 30 years, the population doubles. That's because there's such a young population, and they're going to be having kids in the next 30 years. What form is the residential houses going to look like? Are they going to be apartments? Are they going to be elevated, or are they going to be spread out on the ground but just a lot closer together? The mental image from the Western world is you have a house and it's sort of 600 square meters big, but realistically, to house a population of 2 billion people sustainably, what that residence looks like needs to be thought through. And I think there are some models out there, but I think it can probably be developed further, and I think it can be integrated a lot better. And it needs to happen. It has to happen. It's just how we go about doing it in the next 30 years.
Thanks, Cameron. Igor, any closing words?
I think just to say that Brasilia is an abomination, number one. And number two, I think that mobility, and maybe this is a societal thing, is that the whole idea of having a car is very, very important. And we've actually tried to design the car out of what we're trying to do. because if we can have short streets, close connectivity, and we're starting from scratch, so we have the opportunity to do these things, close connectivity and build density around centers, so the centers replicate themselves as they go along a main spine, you can avoid the trap of the car, because the car is great for excluding the outside world, which is what we're trying not to do.
Fantastic. Thank you, Igor. Bridget, Cameron, thank you very much to the panel. This is a fascinating conversation. We can carry it on, and I hope several of you will end up on the deck for drinks at the end of the next session, and we look forward to conversing with you further then. Thanks very much.